I'm worth $34 million, but I'm $15 million in debt. I know how that sounds. Impossible, maybe even laughable. How does someone with assets worth more than most people will see in 10 lifetimes find themselves drowning in debt that could bankrupt small towns? The answer isn't what you think. It's not about cocaine or gambling or some spectacular business failure that made headlines. It's something far more insidious, something that happens in boardrooms and family dinners and late-night phone calls when the world isn't watching. It's about the weight of expectations, the crushing burden of being exactly who everyone needs you to be, and the moment when you realize that the life you've built, the empire you've created, has become a prison with golden bars. My name is Marcus Holloway, and this is the story of how I became the richest broke man you'll ever meet. It started, as most disasters do, with the best of intentions. I was 28, fresh off my second IPO, and sitting in a conference room overlooking Manhattan with more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. Holloway Technologies had just gone public, and my 18% stake had made me worth $47 million overnight. The reporters called me the next Steve Jobs. Forbes put me on their cover with the headline, "The future has a face." I believed every word. But here's what they don't tell you about sudden wealth. It doesn't just change your bank account. It changes everything. Your relationships, your responsibilities, your very identity becomes tied to those numbers. Within 6 months of the IPO, I had family members I hadn't spoken to in years calling with business opportunities. High school friends suddenly remembered we were close. Charities sent me handwritten letters from sick children. Everyone wanted a piece of the golden boy, and I was young enough and naive enough to think I could give it to them all. The first loan I took out was for my parents. They'd mortgaged their house twice to help fund my first startup, back when no bank would look at a college dropout with big dreams and bigger debt. When Holloway Technologies went public, paying them back felt like breathing. Necessary, automatic, right? But they didn't just want their investment back. They wanted security, the kind that comes from owning something substantial, something they could see and touch. So I put up $5 million of my own money and took out a $12 million loan to buy them a estate in Napa Valley. 40 acres of vineyard, a house with 8 bedrooms they'd never use, and a monthly payment that seemed insignificant against my net worth. That was my first mistake, but not my last, and certainly not my worst. My brother Michael came next. He'd always been the artistic one, the dreamer who painted instead of studying, who wrote poetry while I coded algorithms. When I got rich, he saw his chance to finally make art his living. He needed $2 million to open a gallery in Soho to showcase emerging voices in contemporary art. The bank wouldn't touch him. No credit, no collateral, no business plan beyond passion. But I could co-sign. I could guarantee his loan with my assets. It seemed like such a small thing, helping my brother achieve his dreams. What's $2 million when you're worth 47? The gallery failed within 18 months. The art market, Michael learned too late, is about more than passion. It's about connections, reputation, knowing which critics to court and which collectors to flatter. Michael had talent but no business sense, and passion doesn't pay rent in Manhattan. When the gallery went under, I became responsible for $2 million in debt. I could have paid it off immediately, but my financial advisor suggested I keep the loan and make payments instead. "Better for your credit profile," he said. "Shows you can manage debt responsibly." I should have listened to my gut instead of my advisor. My sister came to me next, then my cousins, then friends from college who suddenly remembered how close we'd been. Each story was compelling, each need legitimate, each amount reasonable when measured against my wealth. A restaurant that just needed capital to expand, a tech startup with a brilliant idea but no funding, a medical bill for a friend's mother who couldn't afford treatment. I wasn't writing checks. I was smart enough to avoid that. I was co-signing loans, using my assets as collateral, leveraging my wealth to help the people I cared about achieve their dreams. The thing about being a guarantor is that it feels generous without feeling expensive. You're not actually spending money. You're just promising to spend it if things go wrong. And when you're worth $47 million, what could possibly go wrong that you couldn't handle? I found out 3 years later. The dot-com bubble burst in 2001, and suddenly the future didn't look so bright. Holloway Technologies' stock price plummeted from $68 to $4 in 6 months. My net worth evaporated like morning dew, dropping from 47 million to less than 2. But the loans didn't evaporate with it. The payments I'd guaranteed didn't disappear. Suddenly, I owed $14 million on loans for other people's dreams, and my own dreams were worth less than the paper they were printed on. That's when I learned the difference between net worth and liquid assets, between being rich and being wealthy. You can be worth millions on paper while having thousands in actual cash. When everyone you'd guaranteed came calling, not because they were malicious, but because their businesses were failing too, because they couldn't make their payments either. I found myself choosing between bankruptcy and scrambling. I chose to scramble. I sold everything I could sell: the penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the Tesla and the Porsche and the collection of vintage guitars I'd bought during my brief rock star fantasy phase. I liquidated my investment accounts and cleaned out my savings. But it wasn't enough. The loans I'd guaranteed totaled $14 million, and after the market crash, I had maybe $3 million in liquid assets. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 20 years of my life. I decided to rebuild rather than declare bankruptcy. I decided that Marcus Holloway wasn't the kind of man who walked away from his obligations, even when those obligations threatened to destroy him. I took out a second mortgage on the one property I'd kept, a modest house in Westchester that my grandfather had left me. I borrowed against my remaining stock options. I negotiated payment plans with creditors, using my reputation as collateral. I promised everyone that I would pay them back, that this was temporary, that Marcus Holloway honored his debts. And slowly, painfully, I started to climb back. I founded 3 companies between 2002 and 2008. The first 2 failed, but they failed small, which felt like victory after the spectacular collapse of Holloway Technologies. The third one, a software company that specialized in financial modeling for small banks, caught the attention of a larger firm. They bought us out for $12 million, and suddenly I could breathe again. I paid off $8 million in loans immediately and found myself worth something again, not $47 million, but enough to sleep without nightmares about creditors and court dates. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought I'd learned my lesson about guaranteeing other people's dreams. I was wrong about both. Success, I've learned, is more addictive than failure. Failure teaches you caution, but success teaches you confidence, and confidence can be more dangerous than any drug. When I sold my third company, when I was financially stable again, when Forbes mentioned me in another article about comeback kings, I felt invincible. I felt like I'd proven something to myself and the world. That's when Elena came into my life. I met her at a charity gala in 2009, one of those Manhattan events where the wealthy gather to bid on art they don't understand while feeling virtuous about causes they barely know. She was there representing a foundation that built schools in developing countries, and when she spoke about education as the fundamental human right, I believed her. When she talked about the children she'd met in Guatemala and Kenya and Bangladesh, children whose lives could be transformed by something as simple as a classroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose beyond profit. Elena Martinez was beautiful in a way that didn't rely on beauty. Intelligent, passionate, committed to something larger than herself. She had a PhD in international development, spoke 4 languages, and could discuss microfinance strategies with the same expertise that most people discuss the weather. When she smiled, which she did often, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. We were married 14 months later. The wedding was small by rich people's standards. Only 200 guests. Only 1 mention in the society pages. Elena didn't want extravagance. She wanted meaning. Instead of expensive flowers, we had simple arrangements and asked guests to donate to her foundation. Instead of a honeymoon in Paris, we spent 3 weeks building a school in rural Peru. I had never been happier. But happiness, I was learning, came with its own costs. Elena's foundation was legitimate, well-run, and desperately underfunded. They operated on grants and donations, and both were unreliable. Projects would start and stall, not because of poor planning, but because of poor funding. Children would wait years for promised schools because a major donor had changed priorities or a government grant had been delayed. Elena would come home from board meetings looking like she'd been physically beaten, exhausted by the gap between what needed to be done and what resources were available. I wanted to fix that gap. I wanted to be the solution to her problem, the answer to her prayers. I started small, a donation here, a grant there. But small donations don't build schools, and Elena's dreams were bigger than my cautious contributions. That's when she told me about the Nepal project. An earthquake had destroyed 17 schools in a rural district, leaving 3,000 children without education. The government had promised to rebuild, but kept delaying, mired in bureaucracy and competing priorities. Elena's foundation had been asked to step in, to provide temporary schools while the permanent rebuilding happened. It was exactly the kind of project that could make a real difference, the kind that could transform communities and generations. It would cost $8 million. Elena never asked me directly. She never said, "Marcus, I need you to fund this project." She was too proud for that, too professional. But I could see it in her eyes when she talked about those children, could hear it in her voice when she described the temporary classrooms they were using. Sheds without heat, rooms without windows, spaces that would be unusable once the monsoon season began. I wanted to be her hero. I wanted to be the husband who could make her dreams come true, who could give her the resources to match her passion. I had $12 million in assets after my company sale, and $8 million seemed like a reasonable investment in my wife's life work. But I didn't have $8 million in cash. I had $12 million in net worth, but most of it was tied up in investments and property and the kind of assets that wealthy people accumulate. To get $8 million in actual money, I would need to liquidate everything, and my financial advisor suggested a different approach. "Borrow against your assets," he said. "Keep your investments growing while supporting the foundation. It's a win-win." I took out an $8 million loan secured by my investment portfolio and real estate holdings. The terms seemed reasonable: 5% interest, 30-year amortization, monthly payments I could easily afford. Elena's foundation would pay me back as they received grants and donations, essentially making me a bridge lender rather than a donor. The Nepal schools were built in 8 months. The photos Elena sent me made me cry. Children sitting in proper classrooms for the first time in 2 years, teachers with blackboards and books and supplies, communities gathering to celebrate their new schools. I had never felt more proud of anything in my life. But the foundation's promised grants never materialized. The government funding they'd been promised was redirected to earthquake relief in other areas. The major donor who had committed to matching funds changed their focus to climate change initiatives. Elena's foundation found itself with 8 beautiful schools and no money to pay me back. I didn't mind at first. The schools were operational, the children were learning, and Elena was happier than I'd ever seen her. What was money compared to that? I could afford the monthly payments on the loan, and eventually the foundation would find funding to reimburse me. But eventually is a dangerous word in finance. The foundation never found the money to pay me back. Not because they weren't trying, not because they were irresponsible, but because international development funding is unpredictable and competitive. Grants that seemed certain fell through. Donors who made promises changed their minds. Government commitments proved to be political rhetoric rather than actual policy. By 2012, I was making monthly payments on an $8 million loan for schools that would never generate revenue to pay it back. I was, essentially, making mortgage payments on education for children I'd never met in a country I'd visited once. It should have stopped there. I should have accepted that I'd made an expensive donation, adjusted my budget and moved on. But Elena's work was just getting started, and my support had made me an integral part of it. "You're not just my husband," she told me one evening as we reviewed foundation reports. "You're our biggest believer, our most important partner. Without you, none of this would exist." She was right, and that felt good. It felt important. It felt like the kind of legacy that mattered more than money. The Madagascar project came next, then the project in Cambodia, then Bangladesh, Guatemala, and Sierra Leone. Each one started with Eleanor showing me photos of children without schools, communities without hope, places where a few $1 million could transform generations. Each one began with promises from other funders, commitments from governments, assurances that this time the foundation would be able to pay me back. By 2015, I had guaranteed loans totaling $22 million for educational projects on 4 continents. My net worth had grown to $34 million through smart investments and another successful business sale, but my debt had grown too. I owed $22 million on projects that generated no income, supported by assets that were increasingly leveraged. I wasn't just Elena's husband anymore. I was the foundation's primary financial backer, the man who made impossible projects possible. Board members praised my commitment to education and global development. Other philanthropists asked for my advice on international giving. Elena was invited to speak at conferences around the world, often introducing me as the visionary investor who makes hope possible. I loved being that man. I loved the speeches and the recognition and the sense that my money was changing the world. When Elena showed me photos of children in our schools, when she read me letters from teachers whose lives had been transformed, when she told me stories about communities that had rallied around education, I felt rich in ways that had nothing to do with bank balances. But bank balances, as I was about to learn again, have a way of asserting their importance. The first sign of trouble came in 2016, when the bank that held my largest education loan was acquired by a larger institution. The new bank reviewed all the acquired loans and decided that mine were riskier than they were comfortable with. They demanded additional collateral and increased my interest rate from 5% to 7%. My monthly payments increased by $43,000. I could handle $43,000. I was making good money from my latest startup, and my investment portfolio was performing well. But it was a reminder that my generosity wasn't free, that the bridge loans I'd made to Elena's foundation came with real financial obligations that could change without warning. The second sign of trouble came when Elena's foundation was selected for a major evaluation by an international development consortium. It should have been good news: recognition of their work, validation of their approach, potential access to larger funding sources. But the evaluation revealed something neither Elena nor I had fully appreciated. The foundation was completely dependent on my financial support. "You've essentially become a one-man development bank," the lead evaluator told us during the exit interview. "While your commitment is admirable, it's also unsustainable. What happens to these projects if something happens to you?" It was a good question, and one that kept me awake for weeks. What would happen to the schools in Nepal and Madagascar and Cambodia if I couldn't make my loan payments? What would happen to the children Elena cared so much about if my business failed or my investments collapsed? The answer was that they would lose everything. The schools would close, the teachers would lose their jobs, and the communities that had rallied around education would be left with empty buildings and broken promises. I wasn't just responsible for my own financial obligations. I was responsible for the hopes and dreams of thousands of people I'd never met. That responsibility felt heavier than the debt itself. I started looking for ways to reduce my exposure, to find other funders who could take over some of the loans I'd guaranteed. I hired a consultant who specialized in philanthropic finance, a woman who had helped other wealthy individuals structure their giving more sustainably. Her recommendation was simple and brutal. I needed to stop making new commitments and start seeking exit strategies for existing ones. "You're not running a foundation," she told me. "You're running a charity Ponzi scheme. You're using new assets to service old debts, and eventually you're going to run out of new assets." She was right, but her advice felt like betrayal. How could I tell Elena that I couldn't support new projects? How could I explain to communities that had been promised schools that the funding had fallen through? How could I walk away from children who needed education just because I needed to protect my own financial stability? I couldn't, so I didn't. The Guatemala project was the beginning of the end. Elena came to me in early 2017 with photos of a village where children were learning in a building that had been condemned by local authorities. The roof leaked, the floor was collapsing, and there was no electricity or running water. The local government had promised a new school but kept delaying construction. Elena's foundation had been asked to step in with a temporary solution that could become permanent once other funding was secured. The project would cost $4 million, and Elena had commitments from 2 major donors that would cover half the cost. All I needed to do was bridge the gap for $2 million, and this time she was confident that the foundation would be able to pay me back within 18 months. I knew I shouldn't do it. My financial advisor had been increasingly stern about my debt-to-asset ratio. My accountant had warned me that I was approaching the limits of what banks would consider safe leverage. My wife had even suggested that maybe the foundation needed to scale back, to focus on maintaining existing projects rather than starting new ones. But when Elena showed me the photos of those children, when she told me about the teacher who was using her own money to buy supplies, when she described the village leader who had walked 3 days to ask for help, I couldn't say no. These weren't numbers on a balance sheet. They were real people with real needs, and I had the power to help them. I took out another loan. The Guatemala school was completed in 10 months, and like all our projects, it was beautiful. The children had proper classrooms, the teachers had supplies and training, and the community had rallied around education in ways that transformed the entire village. When Elena and I visited for the dedication ceremony, we were greeted like heroes. The village mayor presented us with a plaque calling me El Padrino de la Educación, the godfather of education. But the promised donor funding never materialized. One of the major donors had a change in leadership that resulted in a shift in focus from education to healthcare. The other donor experienced their own financial difficulties and had to withdraw their commitment. Elena's foundation was left with another beautiful school and no way to pay me back. By the end of 2017, I owed $26 million on education projects, and none of them were generating revenue to service that debt. My monthly payment obligations had grown to $237,000, and my only source of income was my business ventures and investment returns. That would have been manageable if my business ventures had continued to thrive. But the market was changing, and my latest startup was struggling to find its footing. We'd developed a revolutionary app for personal finance management, but we were competing against tech giants with unlimited resources and better marketing budgets. Despite having a superior product, we were losing market share to inferior competitors who simply had more money to spend on customer acquisition. I needed to inject more capital into the business to compete effectively, but all my assets were already leveraged to support Elena's foundation. I was trapped between my personal obligations and my professional opportunities, unable to fully commit to either. That's when I made the decision that pushed me over the edge. I took out a personal loan for $5 million to fund my struggling startup, using my house and remaining investment assets as collateral. It seemed logical at the time. The startup just needed more runway to achieve profitability. Once we captured more market share, we could either become profitable or attract acquisition offers that would more than repay my investment. It was a calculated risk, the kind that successful entrepreneurs take all the time. But calculated risks don't always calculate correctly. My startup failed in early 2018. Not dramatically, not with scandal or headlines, but with the quiet desperation of a good idea that couldn't find its market. We had great technology, decent user adoption, and no path to profitability. When our main competitor was acquired by Google for $300 million, it became clear that we were never going to be able to compete at their level. I shut down the company in April 2018, 6 months after taking out $5 million to keep it alive. The money was gone, the business was worthless, and I was left with another loan to service. By my 48th birthday, I owed $31 million on various loans and commitments. My assets were worth $34 million, making me technically wealthy while practically drowning. My monthly debt service obligations exceeded $300,000, and my only income was from investment returns that averaged around $100,000 per year. The math was becoming impossible. I was spending more than I was earning, using credit to make loan payments, borrowing against assets to service debt. I had become exactly what my financial consultant had warned against: a charity Ponzi scheme using new debt to service old debt, always one missed payment away from collapse. But the worst part wasn't the financial pressure. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't tell Elena how bad things had gotten without destroying everything she'd worked for. If she knew that our foundation's survival depended entirely on my ability to service unsustainable debt, she would insist on shutting down projects and returning donated funds. The schools we'd built would close, the teachers would lose their jobs, and thousands of children would lose access to education. I couldn't tell my family how leveraged I was without admitting that their security depended on investments that were increasingly risky. My parents were retired in their Napa Valley estate, living comfortably on the assumption that their son was wealthy and successful. My brother had started a new art venture, confident that his successful sibling would support him if needed. I couldn't tell my friends or business associates that the successful entrepreneur they knew was actually drowning in debt. My reputation was my most valuable asset, and admitting financial distress would destroy my ability to raise capital for future ventures. I was surrounded by people who cared about me, but I couldn't tell any of them the truth about my situation. I had become wealthy enough to have $34 million in assets, and desperate enough to lay awake at night wondering how I would make next month's loan payments. That's when I started making the choices that would define who I really was. The first choice came when Elena told me about the Sierra Leone project. A civil war had destroyed most of the educational infrastructure in a rural province, and the foundation had been asked to build 15 schools that could serve as community centers during peacetime and evacuation shelters during conflicts. It was exactly the kind of transformative project that could rebuild an entire region, but it would cost $12 million. Elena was more excited about this project than any we'd undertaken. She'd spent 2 weeks in Sierra Leone, meeting with community leaders and government officials, developing a comprehensive plan that went beyond just building schools. This was about rebuilding civil society, creating hope in places where hope had been destroyed by violence. "This could be our legacy project," she told me, her eyes bright with possibility. "Not just schools, but community centers, medical clinics, places where people can come together and rebuild their lives. We could transform an entire province." She was right. It could be our legacy project. It could also be the project that destroyed us financially. I said yes anyway. I borrowed $8 million against my remaining unencumbered assets and convinced Elena's foundation board to take out a $4 million loan that I personally guaranteed. My monthly debt service obligations increased to over $400,000, exceeding my average monthly income by 30%. I was now technically insolvent, spending more than I earned every month, staying afloat only by liquidating assets and taking on new debt. But the Sierra Leone project was everything Elena had promised. We weren't just building schools. We were rebuilding communities. The impact reports that came back from the field described transformation on a scale that made all the financial stress seem worthwhile. Until my biggest investment went bankrupt. I had invested $3 million in a clean energy startup that seemed perfectly positioned to benefit from growing environmental consciousness. The technology was sound, the management team was experienced, and early adoption rates were promising. The company had all the indicators of success except the most important one: profit. When they declared bankruptcy in late 2018, my $3 million investment became worthless overnight. More importantly, I had borrowed against that investment to fund other obligations. The bank that had loaned me money using the clean energy stock as collateral now demanded immediate repayment of $2 million. I didn't have $2 million in cash. I didn't have $200,000 in cash. Every liquid asset I owned was committed to monthly debt service payments, and every illiquid asset was already being used as collateral for other loans. For the first time in 20 years, I seriously considered bankruptcy. Bankruptcy would have solved my immediate financial problems. I could have discharged most of my debts, protected my primary residence, and started over with a clean slate. Millions of Americans file for bankruptcy every year, and there's no shame in admitting that debt has become unmanageable. But bankruptcy would have meant more than just financial relief for me. It would have meant shutting down Elena's foundation. The schools we'd built would lose their funding and would probably close. The teachers we'd trained would lose their jobs. The communities that had organized around education would see their hopes collapse. Most importantly, it would have meant admitting to Elena that everything we'd built together was based on unsustainable finances. She would learn that her life's work existed only because her husband had been willing to mortgage his future to fund her dreams. I couldn't do it. I couldn't destroy what we'd built together. Couldn't break the hearts of children who depended on our schools. Couldn't admit that Marcus Holloway had failed at the thing that mattered most to him. So I found another way. I started selling everything that wasn't nailed down. The art collection I'd accumulated during my successful years. The wine collection I'd built with my father. The vintage guitars and rare books and antique furniture that had made my house feel like a home. I sold my car and started using ride shares. I cancelled my country club membership and my subscription services and every expense that wasn't absolutely essential. It wasn't enough. Even liquidating everything I could sell, I was still short $300,000 every month. I needed to find a way to either increase my income or reduce my debt obligations, and neither seemed possible. That's when I discovered that other people had discovered my situation. The first approach came from a debt consolidation company that specialized in high-net-worth individuals facing temporary liquidity challenges. They could combine all my loans into a single payment with a lower interest rate, reducing my monthly obligations by almost 40%. The catch was that they would need to take ownership of my investment portfolio as collateral, and if I missed payments, they could liquidate everything immediately. I almost took their offer. 40% less monthly payment would have made my situation manageable, at least temporarily. But their contract included clauses that made me nervous. They could call the entire loan if my net worth dropped below a certain threshold, and they could change the terms if they determined that I was taking excessive risks with my remaining assets. I didn't trust them, but more importantly, I didn't trust myself to avoid the behaviors that had gotten me into this situation. If they reduced my monthly obligations, would I use the breathing room to stabilize my situation, or would I use it to take on new commitments? Given my history, the answer seemed obvious. The second approach came from someone who understood my situation more intimately, another philanthropist who had faced similar challenges. Richard Blackstone had built a fortune in real estate development and had used it to fund environmental conservation projects around the world. Like me, he had started by making bridge loans to conservation organizations, and like me, he had found himself over-leveraged when those organizations couldn't pay him back. The thing about philanthropic lending, he told me over dinner at his club, is that it's not really lending. It's donating with extra steps. Once you guarantee a loan for a cause you believe in, you're never getting that money back. The charity might pay you back, but you're never going to demand payment if it means shutting down projects you care about. He was right, and his insight was both liberating and terrifying. I had been thinking of my foundation loans as investments that would eventually be repaid, but they were really donations that I was still paying for. Every month, I was donating $300,000 to Elena's foundation, and I would continue donating that money for the next 27 years. The question, Richard continued, is whether you're comfortable with that reality. If you accept that you're donating $300,000 a month to education, are you satisfied with the impact you're having? If yes, then find a way to sustain it. If no, then find a way to exit gracefully. I thought about his question for weeks. Was I satisfied with donating $300,000 a month to education? When I looked at the photos from our schools, when I read the impact reports from our field staff, when Elena told me stories about children whose lives had been transformed by access to education, the answer was yes. I was proud of what we had accomplished, proud of the legacy we were building, proud to be the man who made impossible dreams possible. But pride doesn't pay bills, and satisfaction doesn't service debt. I needed to find a sustainable way to continue supporting Elena's work without bankrupting myself. That led me to consider options I had never thought possible. The first option was to sell my house. It was worth about $4 million, and I owed about $800,000 on the mortgage. If I sold it and moved to something smaller, I could free up over $3 million to pay down debt and reduce my monthly obligations significantly. But the house wasn't just where I lived. It was where Elena and I had built our life together. It was where we'd planned our foundation projects, where we'd celebrated our successes, where we'd grieved our failures. It was the place that felt most like home, and selling it would feel like admitting defeat. The second option was to sell some of Elena's foundation projects back to the communities they served or to other organizations that could take over their operation. If I could get even partial repayment for what I'd invested, I could reduce my debt burden substantially. But that option felt like betrayal. These communities had been promised permanent schools, not temporary ones that could be sold if the funding got complicated. The children in these schools weren't assets to be liquidated. They were the reason Elena and I had started this work in the first place. The third option was the one I'd been avoiding. Telling Elena the truth about our financial situation and letting her decide whether the Foundation's work was worth the risk of losing everything. I chose the third option, and it changed everything. I told her on a Tuesday evening in March 2019, after she'd returned from a site visit to Madagascar. She was exhausted but excited, full of stories about improvements to the school we'd built there, updates on students who were excelling, news about community projects that had grown out of the education initiatives we'd funded. "Elena," I said, when she'd finished telling me about a girl named Anya who wanted to become a doctor, "I need to tell you something about our finances." I explained everything. The loans I'd guaranteed, the debt service obligations that exceeded my income, the asset sales that had kept us afloat, the reality that our foundation existed entirely because I had been willing to mortgage our future to fund it. "I'm worth $34 million, I told her, "but I owe $31 million, and I can't make the payments anymore. If we keep going the way we're going, we'll lose everything within 2 years. The house, the investments, the foundation, everything." Elena listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that might have been grief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the garden we'd planted together. "How long have you been carrying this alone?" she finally asked. 3 years, I admitted. "Maybe 4. It's been getting worse gradually, and I kept thinking I could fix it, kept believing that the next business venture would generate enough income to make it sustainable. And you never thought to tell me." "I couldn't. If you knew how precarious everything was, you would have wanted to shut down projects, and I couldn't bear the thought of those children losing their schools because of my financial problems." Elena turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Disappointment. Not anger, not fear, but disappointment. "Marcus," she said softly, "those children deserve better than schools that exist only because their funding source is too proud to admit he's drowning. What happens to them when you can't pay anymore? What happens to them when this all collapses?" She was right, and I knew she was right, but hearing her say it felt like being punched. I had been so focused on being her hero, on being the husband who could make her dreams come true, that I had never considered that my heroism might actually be selfishness in disguise. "We need to shut it down," she said, and her voice broke as she said it. "All of it. We need to find other organizations to take over our projects, and we need to focus on saving what we can of your financial situation." "I can't," I said. "I can't disappoint all those people, can't break promises to all those communities." "You're not breaking promises," Elena replied. "You're admitting that you made promises you couldn't keep. There's a difference." That night, Eleanor and I began the process of unwinding our foundation's operations. It was the hardest thing either of us had ever done. We spent months negotiating with other development organizations to take over our schools. We worked with community leaders to ensure continuity of education services. We found ways to honor our commitments to teachers and staff while transferring operational responsibility to more sustainable funding sources. Some projects transferred seamlessly. The Nepal schools were absorbed by a larger international development organization that had been looking for opportunities to expand into educational infrastructure. The Madagascar project was taken over by a French foundation with established operations in that region. But some projects couldn't be transferred. The Sierra Leone schools were too remote and too expensive to interest other organizations. 2 of the Guatemala projects were closed because no other funders stepped forward. Elena and I watched helplessly as communities that had organized around education saw their schools shuttered, their teachers unemployed, their hopes deferred indefinitely.